The week Sergeant First Class Lennox arrived at the Mountain Warfare Training Center. It snowed 4 inches in July. Nobody mentioned it. The instructors walked through it like it was expected, like the mountain itself was testing the new arrivals before they'd even unpacked their gear. Lennox noticed, though. She noticed everything. It was the thing that had kept her alive in Kandahar, and before that in the Korangal, and before that in 100 places that didn't make the news and wouldn't. You either developed the habit of watching, or you didn't last long enough to develop any habits at all. She was 31 years old. She had been in the Army for 12 years. She had more confirmed long-range engagements than anyone in her battalion, and she had spent the last 3 of those years as a marksmanship instructor at Fort Benning, teaching soldiers to breathe correctly before they pulled a trigger. She was good at it. She was good at most things that required patience and stillness and the ability to disappear into the background until the moment you needed not to. The Mountain Warfare Training Center at Bridgeport, California, sat at 6,700 feet. The cadre there had a reputation. You either knew it going in, or you learned it fast enough that it didn't matter whether you'd known it before. Staff Sergeant Oban was the first one to say it out loud. He said it in the equipment bay on the first afternoon while Lennox was going through her issued kit with the methodical focus she brought to everything. He didn't say it to her. He said it to the man beside him, Corporal Dunmore, just loud enough that the words carried the 4 feet between them and landed exactly where he'd intended them to land. "Command's sending us a range instructor," he said. "Think they ran out of real candidates." Dunmore said nothing. He had the look of a man who understood that silence in these moments was a form of agreement, and agreement was the safest posture available. Lennox finished logging her gear. She moved on to the next item on the checklist. The course was 6 weeks. Advanced mountain operations, long-range reconnaissance, precision fire and altitude conditions, the kind of training that separated people who were capable from people who were exceptional. Lennox had been told before she arrived that fewer than 40% of candidates finished. She had been told this by Major Trent, her commanding officer back at Benning, who had looked at her file for a long moment and then looked at her and said, with what she understood to be genuine concern, "You sure about this, Lennox? Bridgeport's a different animal." She had told him she was sure. What she hadn't told him was why. She didn't have a clean reason she could hand to another person and expect them to hold without dropping it. It had to do with her father, partly. It had to do with something an instructor named Okafor had told her when she was still a specialist, that the difference between a soldier who is good and a soldier who is exceptional is that one of them knows what they're proving and the other one doesn't. Lennox had thought about that for a long time. She had decided she needed to know. The first week was physical. Altitude acclimatization, rucking, load-bearing at elevation. By the end of day 2, 3 candidates had dropped. By the end of day 4, 2 more were gone. Nobody talked about who left or why. The cadre didn't acknowledge it. There were simply fewer people at formation each morning, and the mountain didn't care either way. Lennox kept pace. She didn't try to be first. She had learned, over 12 years, that being first in the early stages was a kind of vanity that cost you later. She ran the math constantly. How much energy was this taking? How much would she need in reserve? What was the actual objective here, and what was theater? Most people couldn't separate those two things. Most people spent a significant portion of their lives performing effort rather than directing it. Captain Elroy ran the course. He was 52 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that communicated nothing except alertness. He had been running the Mountain Warfare Training Center for 6 years. Before that, he had done 2 tours in Afghanistan with 10th Special Forces Group and 1 advisory mission in Colombia that nobody talked about in writing. He was precise in his speech, economical in his movement, and profoundly skeptical of people who made things look easier than they were. On day 8, he watched Lennox on the repelling face. She came down clean, controlled, no wasted motion. He made it a note. He didn't know yet what kind of note it was. The second week was technical. Navigation at altitude, cold weather survival, land movement through terrain that had no interest in accommodating the people moving through it. The Sierras at that elevation were not hostile exactly. They were simply indifferent, which was a different thing entirely and in some ways harder to manage. Hostility you could orient against. Indifference required you to produce your own orientation from inside without anything external to push against. On the night navigation exercise, Lennox made a decision that she would think about for a long time afterward. The assigned route took the team through a ridgeline that she assessed, standing at the start point in the dark, with a map and a red-filtered flashlight, as technically passable but operationally wasteful. There was an alternate approach that cut 40 minutes off the route and avoided 2 sections of loose scree that she calculated would cost the team more time and energy than the shortcut saved on paper. The alternate route was not unauthorized. It simply wasn't the obvious choice, and nobody had suggested it. She suggested it. Oben looked at the map. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has already decided the answer is no, but who is working through the mechanics of how to explain why without exposing the actual reason. The assigned route, he started, uses the ridgeline and adds 42 minutes, Lennox said. The alternate avoids the scree sections on the north face, which are going to be ice-glazed by now. We'll spend the first 20 minutes going backwards to avoid a fall, and then we'll be behind the whole exercise. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. It's not the assigned route, Oben said. It's not prohibited either, Lennox said. I checked. He went with the assigned route. He was the senior man on the team, and that was his call to make, and Lennox didn't argue it further. They hit the scree sections at hour 2, exactly as she'd calculated. The first section took 31 minutes. The second took 19. They finished the exercise 48 minutes. Behind the lead team, Oben said nothing during the debrief. Lennox said nothing either. What would have been the point? The third week was marksmanship. Precision fire at altitude, in variable wind, at ranges from 400 to 900 meters. It was where Lennox had lived for 3 years. It was what she knew the way other people knew their native language. Not something she had to think through, just something that was already there when she needed it. She noticed the shift in the cadre on the second day of the marksmanship block. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might not see unless you were already watching for it. Sergeant Price, who ran the range, gave her a data card with a wind call that she clocked immediately as 2 miles an hour low. She adjusted. She didn't say anything about the card. She just put the round where it needed to go and moved to the next position. But she knew the card was wrong, and she was fairly certain the card had been wrong, in a direction that would have produced a miss if she'd trusted it rather than her own read. The next day, the data card was wrong again. Different error, same category. The kind of mistake that would have been invisible to someone less experienced, and that would have produced a consistent pattern of near misses that looked like shooter error rather than data error. Lennox documented both. She wrote the actual conditions, the given data, her adjustments, and her results in the small green notebook she carried everywhere. She did not confront Price. She did not mention it to Oben. She kept shooting, and she kept documenting. And on the 4th day of the marksmanship block, she shot a 97 out of 100 at 800 meters in winds that had shifted 4 times in the last hour, and the man on the position next to her, a Special Forces candidate named Sutter, who had been shooting for 8 years and had 3 combat deployments, looked at her when they called the target and said very quietly what she said, nothing. It wasn't a question that needed an answer. Captain Elroy reviewed the scorecards that evening. He reviewed them twice. On the morning of day 22, he stopped her after formation. Lennox, he said. She stopped. Your marksmanship scores, sir, they're inconsistent with your data cards. She looked at him directly. This was the moment she'd been carrying since the second day of the marksmanship block. She had prepared for it, not by rehearsing what she'd say. She didn't work that way, but by being certain, completely certain, about what she knew and how she knew it. With respect, sir, she said, I'd like to know specifically what the inconsistency is, whether my scores are inconsistent above or below the data, and whether the data cards have been reviewed for accuracy against the actual range conditions. He was quiet for a moment. You're saying the cards were wrong. I'm saying I documented the conditions at the time of each shot, along with the given data and my adjustments, and that I have that documentation available if it would be useful for comparison. He looked at her for a long moment, not with skepticism exactly, with something more like recalibration. You kept your own record? Yes, sir. Why? She thought about how to answer that, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the honest answer was more complex than the situation probably warranted. Because I've found it's useful to have your own record, she said, separate from the official one. He asked to see the notebook. She gave it to him. He spent 11 minutes with it, standing in the morning cold at 7,200 feet with the notebook open in his hands. Lennox stood at ease and looked at the ridge to the north, where the snow from the previous night had settled into the rock and the light was doing something complicated with the shadows. When he was finished, he handed the notebook back to her without a word and walked toward the range office. She didn't know what that meant. She was getting better at tolerating not knowing what things meant. The fourth week was the one that broke people. Combined operations, marksmanship integrated with movement, navigation, team function. All the individual skills you had built, thrown together and tested under conditions that were designed to reveal which of those skills were actually yours and which ones only appeared to belong to you when everything else was convenient. On day 26, Oben went down with a knee injury. He was medevaced out in the afternoon. Lennox was the next senior person on the team. She didn't make a speech about it. She didn't acknowledge the transition in any formal way. She looked at what needed to happen. She communicated it clearly to Dunmore and to Sutter, who had folded into their team after his original group dropped to 3 people. And she got to work. Sutter was the interesting one. He had been skeptical of her for the first 2 weeks in the way that experienced people often were skeptical of people who made their craft look effortless. It read as something other than skill at first, until you watched it under enough conditions to understand what you were actually seeing. By the end of day 27, Sutter had stopped being skeptical. He didn't announce this change. He simply started watching how she moved and how she made decisions in the quiet way that serious people watch other serious people. On day 29, the team conducted a long-range interdiction exercise. They were given a target, a window, and a set of terrain constraints. The range was listed at 100 meters. The conditions were a crosswind from the northwest at 12, gusting to 17. The light was fading. Lennox built the firing solution in her head and then built it again on paper. The numbers agreed with each other, which was what she wanted them to do. She settled into position at 1642, and she ran through her breathing, and she found the stillness that she had spent 12 years learning how to access on demand, the place where the wind and the elevation and the fading light and the 24 variables that could take this shot away from her became a single coherent picture rather than a collection of threats. She fired at 1644. The hit came back confirmed at 1644 and some seconds, which was the right amount of time for a round to travel 100 meters and for the sound of impact to reach the spotter. Dunmore said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "First round, she confirmed. They moved to the exfil point without discussing it further. There was nothing to discuss. Either the round found the target or it didn't. It had. Captain Elroy was waiting at the debrief. He had the results from all 7 teams that had run the exercise that afternoon. He went through them in order, which meant he got to Lennox's team 3rd from last, which meant she had to sit through 4 other debrief reports while carrying the knowledge of how her team had done and choosing not to demonstrate impatience about when it would be acknowledged. This was a skill she had also spent years developing. When he reached their team's results, he read the numbers without inflection. Distance, conditions, time on target, round count. 1 round. He stopped there for a moment, not dramatically, just a pause. "First round," he said. "Yes, sir." He moved on. After the debrief, Sutter found her outside the building. "How long have you been shooting like that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Long time," she said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're processing something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories they've been using. "Benning sends you here," he said, "and you're—" He stopped. "They didn't know what they were sending." "Benning knew exactly what they were sending," she said. "That's why they sent me." He thought about that for a minute. Then he said, "You keep a notebook on everything, don't you?" "I do. Good habit." She didn't tell him why the habit had started. That was her own business. The 5th week was the leadership assessment, individual planning exercises, team decisions under stress, resource allocation with incomplete information. The scenarios were designed to have no clean answer. They were designed to reveal how a person thought under pressure, whether they would optimize for the right thing or the comfortable thing, and whether they could hold a team together when the situation gave the team legitimate reasons to come apart. Lennox knew this about herself. She was not naturally a person who led by presence. She was not tall. She did not have a booming voice. She did not inspire the particular animal confidence that some leaders produce just by walking into a room. What she had was clarity. She could read a situation very fast and very accurately, communicate what she saw in language that was direct without being abrasive, and make a decision and stand behind it until she had a specific reason to revise it. Some people found this manner cold. She had been told this several times over the years, and she had thought about it each time with some seriousness. And she had arrived at the conclusion that the people who found it cold were generally people who preferred their leaders to produce reassurance over accuracy, and she had nothing to offer in that department. On day 33, she made a call that was wrong. The team was moving to an extraction point through a terrain feature that she had assessed as the fastest available route. She had been right about that assessment. What she had not factored correctly was a secondary wind pattern through the valley that slowed the team's movement and pushed their timeline outside the extraction window. They missed the window by 11 minutes. In the debrief, Captain Elroy walked through the decision. "The route selection," he said. "Walk me through it." She walked through it. She identified the point where her assessment had been incomplete, specifically that she had used the standard wind table for that elevation without accounting for the valley effect that should have been predictable from the terrain map. "I should have caught it from the map," she said. "I didn't." "No," he said. There was a pause. "What's the correction?" he said. "Always run the valley effect calculations separately when there's a canyon feature within half a kilometer of the route. It adds 4 minutes to the planning phase, and it's worth it." He made a note, not in the way someone makes a note of an error, in the way someone makes a note of something useful. The 6th week was the final integrated exercise. Everything combined. 72 hours in the field, no resupply, a series of objectives that compounded as you met them. The cadre didn't tell you the full picture at the start. They handed you the first objective, and you had to earn the next one by completing the first one well enough to demonstrate that you could handle more information. By this point, the course had 31 candidates remaining out of an original 44. Lennox was the only woman. She had been the only woman since day one. This was a fact about the course. The same way the elevation was a fact about the course. You could think about it or you could think about the work. She had made her choice about that on day one and had not revisited it. The final exercise was brutal in the particular way that things are brutal when they are designed by intelligent people who know exactly where the failure points are and have arranged the exercise to find them. It was cold, it was dark for most of it. The terrain compounded every decision and charged interest on every mistake. On hour 41, with 9 hours left in the exercise, Lennox's team reached the 4th objective under conditions that should have forced a modification to the plan. There was a storm system that hadn't been in the forecast. Not a severe storm, not the kind that would result in the exercise being halted, but the kind that added a meaningful variable to the remaining objectives and required a decision about how to allocate the team's remaining resources. Sutter looked at the conditions and looked at Lennox. "Your call," he said. She thought about the remaining objectives. She thought about the team's current state. Dunmore was running. On about 70%, his ankle had been bothering him since hour 30, and he'd said nothing about it, and she'd said nothing about it. But she knew, and he knew she knew. She thought about the storm and what it would do to visibility and footing and timing. "We modify the route on Objective 5, she said. "Add 30 minutes. Cut the exposure on the ridgeline. Protect Dunmore's ankle for the last push. We can still hit the window." Dunmore looked at her sideways. He hadn't said anything about his ankle. "I've been watching you favor it since hour 30, she said. "It's not a weakness. It's information. We use information." He was quiet for a moment. "Understood," he said. They modified the route. They hit Objective 5 11 minutes early. They used the buffer on the final approach and reached the extraction point with 4 minutes to spare, in full darkness, in deteriorating conditions, with every required objective met and documented. Captain Elroy was at the extraction point. The cadre was always at the extraction point. It was one of those military traditions that seemed ceremonial from the outside and wasn't. He looked at the team's documentation. He looked at the timeline. He looked up. He didn't say much. That was not his style. He said the objectives had been completed within parameters, which, in the language of Bridgeport, meant something different than it would have meant anywhere else. Because at Bridgeport, everything that was within parameters had been earned in a specific and unambiguous way. The graduation ceremony, such as it was, happened on the morning of day 43. No families, no speeches, no ceremony of the kind that produces photographs. The remaining candidates stood in a line in the cold, and Captain Elroy walked down the line, and that was essentially it. When he reached Lennox, he stopped. He looked at her for a moment. "Your notebook?" he said. "Sir, the documentation practice. I'm recommending it be incorporated into the marksmanship block curriculum." She looked at him directly. "Because of the data card discrepancy," she said. "Because of the data card discrepancy," he confirmed. "The documentation you provided identified a systematic calibration error in the range data sets that we hadn't caught. It affected the assessment of 3 candidates in the previous course cycle." She absorbed this. "Did those candidates retest?" she said. "2 of them did. One had already left the Army." She didn't say anything about that. There was nothing to say about it that was useful. The fact was what it was. All she had been able to do was what she'd done. Keep her own record. Provide it when it was asked for. Let the record speak to what it was evidence of. "Lennox," he said. "Sir, what made you start keeping your own record?" It was the first time he had asked her a question that wasn't about the task at hand. She thought about the honest answer, which was long and complicated, and had to do with her father and with Sergeant Okafor, and with a dozen moments she had carried for 12 years. She gave him the honest answer in the compressed form that was the best she could do with it right then. "I learned early that the official record and the accurate record aren't always the same thing," she said, "and that if you don't maintain your own, you have no basis to correct the official one when they diverge." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved on down the line. Afterward, when the formation had dispersed, Sutter found her again. He had a habit of finding her afterward, she had noticed. After the important moments, she didn't mind it. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. She waited. "Day 8. The ridgeline navigation. You had the right answer, and Oban didn't take it, and it cost the team 48 minutes. It did. You never said anything about it afterward." "The exercise was over," she said. "The point wasn't to be right about the route. The point was to demonstrate the analysis clearly enough that the person making the call could make an informed decision. He made his decision. That's not a failure of the analysis." Sutter thought about that. "Most people would have called that a loss," he said. "Most people would," she said. "But the measurement isn't whether your recommendation gets adopted. The measurement is whether you gave the clearest picture you could with the information you had, and whether you were honest when you didn't have enough information, and whether you kept your record straight regardless of whether anyone was checking it." He was quiet for a while. "You've been thinking about this for a long time," he said. 12 years, she said. She picked up her kit and started toward the processing area. The mountain was behind her, white in the morning light, indifferent as always. She had passed through it, and it had not changed, and she had. That was how it was supposed to work. That was how it had always worked, for anyone who came here and earned the right to leave. The notebook was in her left chest pocket, where she always kept it. It was almost full. She would need a new one. She had already decided what she was going to write on the first page. "Keep your own record, the accurate one."